made it, everyone. It's the end of month 9, the month of Valifor, and of course, we're gonna have to take a deep look into Final Fantasy IX. And even on top of that, happy coincidence is that this is one of those milestone arbitrary number videos. This is the 75th video of this year Final Fantasy project that I've been working on for the past, well, 9 months. And of course, like I said, this being the 9th month, we're talking about Final Fantasy IX. Finally, after Final Fantasy 7 and 8, the crystal returns. Well, to be completely fair, the crystal didn't go anywhere in 7 and 8, but it wasn't really as apparent as it is here. As you may have guessed, Final Fantasy IX is in my top rotating 3 Final Fantasy games just in general, and I've kind of commandeered its signature crystal for part of my logos, so this game is very, very special to me. As a little introduction, Final Fantasy IX is the last iteration of the series on PlayStation 1, and it's quite amazing to see the power that the PlayStation could put out after the developers really got a hold of the system and began optimizing games for it. Just look at Final Fantasy VII's graphics compared to the game, and it almost feels like a completely different generation. For Final Fantasy IX, Square moved forward by looking back to the roots of the series, and really this is a celebration of everything Final Fantasy, at least up until that time. Interestingly enough, it was developed in parallel with Final Fantasy X and XI, and Square's done something clever here during this development process to show the breadth of development styles as we've seen different aspects of gameplay intertwine. For instance, Final Fantasy IX looks to the past, while Final Fantasy X looks to the future, and Final Fantasy XI is sort of a melding of both with their online experience. But those will come in due time, so let's focus on Final Fantasy IX now. I want to do something a little bit different than I usually do with these grand end of the month videos. This time I really want to start off the exploration by looking at the marketing campaign. As I remember, this game had a very profound impact on me. It's when I really started getting into gaming magazines and stuff like that. The internet was just coming of age, and there are some really interesting kind of rumors flying around the internet at that time and some misleading magazine headlines that, well, I'll get into that in a minute. So Final Fantasy IX had a huge marketing campaign, and in fact the game itself was primarily developed in Hawaii for a compromise between the American and the Japanese teams. At this time, since Final Fantasy 7 and 8 came out, Final Fantasy got a huge audience in the States. It became basically mainstream at the time. So to appease everyone, they kind of made this compromise. As of this time, Dragon Quest is still actually one of the top games, and in fact it had a very profound impact on Final Fantasy IX itself, which I'll get into in a second. So I suspect really that the kind of look back to Final Fantasy IX was a little bit of a lot of different things. I can't really find any kind of hard evidence on this, but I think that it really was a response to the contentious Final Fantasy VIII that we had talked about last month. Final Fantasy VIII did a lot of different stuff, and a lot of people weren't exactly happy with it, and even today, it's one of the games that divides the fan base completely. So I think they wanted to just take a look at where they came from and make a traditional, at least as traditional as they could, Final Fantasy game, because they really hadn't made one in 3D like this yet. And in fact, you can see some similar scenarios play out in other franchises. The biggest example I can think of is in the tabletop world, when we saw the introduction of Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition, pushing boundaries, something completely and radically different than what had come before. And the vocal outrage pushed them to make 5th edition, which was harkening back to the roots of the game, and it's pretty much exactly paralleled with what we've seen here. At least that's what I get out of it. Anyway, Final Fantasy IX's marketing campaign was incredibly expansive, partnering with giants like Coca-Cola, in which they had some incredibly detailed FMV commercials that were created specifically for advertising, which is just mind-blowing to me because way back then, having this computer-generated stuff was a big task, and just let's watch the commercial. 君へつながるコカ・コーラ So it's pretty great, right? So while Square was pushing out this marketing blitz in the realm of gaming magazines and journalism and things like that, we started to see what is maybe the progenitor of clickbait that we would know of today. When I think back, leading up to Final Fantasy IX, it's kind of strange because I distinctly got the impression that this was going to be the last Final Fantasy game basically ever. And it's more than likely just my imagination kind of looking back at it, maybe nostalgia blowing this out of proportion, but I really was under the impression that the series was ending with this game that was their magnum opus. Probably probably in part to magazines that had gaming covers like this, which is misleading if you just glance at it, as well as the rumors being surrounded on the game, being that this was their retrospective on the series, it was their Final Fantasy, of course on the PlayStation, but that's always in super tiny letters, so I figured they wanted to go out on a high note or something maybe. And yeah, I just have a really very much intense memory of that being the kind of feeling that I got. This was the last game. Of course, at that time, I don't think I actually knew about Final Fantasy X being developed in conjunction until much later. But anyway, let's move on to some of the release data and give the developers their due for creating this masterpiece of a game. The game was released in Japan on July 7th of 2000. A few months later, November 13th of 2000, it came over to the States, and a few more months after that, it got released in the PAL region on February 16th, 2001. Little piece of information that I came across is that the game was actually slated to be released earlier, but it was postponed because that's what happens whenever Dragon Quest VII comes out on the same day that your Final Fantasy game is coming out. This is a really good example of how massive in popularity that the Dragon Quest franchise is in Japan, seeing as it actually shoved Final Fantasy from its original release date. Seriously, the people in Japan love Dragon Quest. It started to take hold over here a little bit, but Final Fantasy is nothing compared to Dragon Quest over there. Yeah, that's just a really crazy bit of information that I came across. Anyway, the director of the game was Hiroyuki Ito, who was called back as director from the superb Final Fantasy VI. The producer was the one and only Hironobu Sakaguchi. He's the man that started it all, and this really has a lot of influences from him. I mean, you can just feel that the game is a Sakaguchi game. And he actually said that this game was by far his favorite of the series because he thought this was the essence of Final Fantasy, and I don't disagree. This game is what I think of when I think of Final Fantasy. As far as the visuals and art go, we have Hideo Manaba as the art director again, but the spotlight here is that we have the return of Amano and his interpretations of the characters. In fact, he was the lead character designer, unlike the previous Final Fantasy 7 and 8, which had Nomura taking the lead on that. So big welcome back to Amano, and you can absolutely see his influence here. And of course, I sound like a broken record at this point, but we have the one and only Nobuo Uematsu working on the musical score for this game, and it's still top tier soundtrack. Personally, it doesn't beat out 8 for me, but there are some incredibly good pieces here, especially Dark Messenger and the Harvest Dance to spotlight a few. So after Final Fantasy IX was released, it actually wasn't ported to the PC immediately, unlike its previous counterparts of 7 and 8, who basically made the jump right after it came out. So with that being said, it seemed like Final Fantasy IX was just not going to be available on PC ever. But it turns out that about a decade and a half later, Final Fantasy IX did eventually come out on Steam as a remaster, not a remake, but a remaster, and it's a fantastic one at that. This being very topical, that Final Fantasy IX remaster came out on the PlayStation 4 about a week ago or so as of this recordings. It is a very, very good remaster. It's one of the most impressive PS1 remasters I've ever seen. Definitely pick this one up if you can ASAP if you haven't played it. This would be the game to start if you're looking to get into Final Fantasy, no doubt. So let's move on and talk a little bit about the gameplay. And while there's some new additions here, it does really look back on the previous games and refines a lot of those mechanics. It doesn't necessarily introduce much new here, but it refines everything. This game is a highly polished game, and you're going to hear me say that a few times. This particular Final Fantasy is one of my favorite as far as how character progression works. We return to the leveling system that we've known from Final Fantasy, where Final Fantasy VIII kind of deviated a little bit from. And it feels like classic Final Fantasy for the most part. The interesting thing is how acquisition of skills and magic are acquired. Each piece of equipment has a particular skill or ability or magic associated with it, so whenever you equip it, you gain not only experience points after battling, but ability points as well. And if you get enough ability points, you can master that skill or ability or magic, whatever, and you can just have it on your character, and you can equip something else, another weapon or armor or whatever it happens to be. Each skill requires a certain amount of AP, and it's just a nice and easy system. There's no drawing mechanics or materia or anything like that. It is just a straightforward Final Fantasy. There's also some passive abilities in here, so not only are they like magic and active skills, but you have different things that you can kind of augment your character with. For instance, you could do more damage to a particular type of enemy. You have some things like auto potions, being immune to various status effects, poison, silence, all of that kind of stuff. So there's a lot to work with here. Another welcome callback, at least for me personally, is the way that characters are handled via a sort of job system, kind of. Really, it's exactly how Final Fantasy IV handled them, and there are specific jobs called out by their job names that we know of in Final Fantasy, but your characters are basically defined by the job that they're in, and you can't really change it like Final Fantasy V or Tactics or whatever. It's definitely classic Final Fantasy, and I love it. A new addition to the franchise though, and it's not terribly, mind-blowing, but we have this thing called active time events that are mostly optional, and they provide little vignettes into specific characters and provide some pretty deep growth as a character in regards to their view on life. And in fact, this game is all about the narrative and the growth of characters, and that's why it's one of people's favorite. Along with these little vignettes of story elements, we also have basically one of the earlier origins of what we now know as quick time events, where button prompts are displayed and you have to hit the corresponding button in a given amount of time and you'll achieve some kind of outcome. This is nothing new, and in fact, it seems that the majority of people hate this in new games, but during the time that Final Fantasy IX came out, this was a relatively new idea and novel concept, and it's not used excessively in here. The battles themselves return to 4-party members, whereas Final Fantasy VII and VIII only allowed for 3. Battle animations and spell animations are superb, and we go back to a more traditional sounding battle theme. So let's move on to the most important aspect of the game, and that is the cast of characters. This cast is one of the best of the franchise for sure, save for one member that I'm personally not too happy about. There was a big missed opportunity there, but I'll save that for the end. So let's go with the rundown here, and let's first start off with our main character, Zidane. Zidane's an interesting protagonist. He's a thief in a classical job sense, which is exactly what you would expect, but there's so much more to him than that. In fact, the very first exposure that we get to him is that he's sliding down this pole, and the first feature that you see of our main character is that he has a tail, which you may chalk up to being some kind of quirky character trait, and it is, but it's also much more than that. And in lieu of spoilers, that's all I can possibly say. Zidane's primary motivation is to simply help people. He wants to have this virtue that maybe he hasn't been letting himself achieve. You're gonna see that with a lot of these characters. They have a particular kind of moral ambiguity, something that's holding them back, and they have to overcome it. And really all of these characters possess in some sense all of these little moral ambiguities that are more prominent in some characters than in others, and you'll see what I'm talking about if you ever play the game or just hear talking about some of the others. Next up, we have possibly one of the most beloved characters in the series, and that is Vivi, and he is a black mage. Vivi is the first time Square has ever attempted to give the classic black mage characteristics, him actually feeling, him having a personality, and they go hard with it here. And I'm talking about the classic black mage, pointy hat, no face, yellow eyes, short blue and black robed figure. While you may have an image of a black mage in your head being completely and utterly destruction based, thank you 8-bit theater, Vivi is one of the most timid and shy characters in the game, and his story arc, figuring out who he is, where he comes from, why he's there, it's one of the best in the series, absolutely hands down. After that, we have of course Steiner, the stalwart knight, unflinching in loyalty. Steiner's our basic fighter character here, high defense, decent damage dealing, and unlike Vivi, Steiner already knows his role in the world, to be an unwavering loyal protector to the princess and the queen. However, what can be said about Vivi's character arc can be applied here as well. Steiner has an incredibly transformative personality throughout the game, and it's enthralling to watch his struggles between what he thinks is right and what he thinks is loyal. Next up, we have our first female main character, and that would be Princess Garnet, better known as Dagger, fitting her growing view of the world as a whole. With her, people you once trusted can no longer be trusted, and those that don't seem trustworthy turn out being the most trusting. There's a lot to say here about Garnet, and she's a pivotal character in the first maybe half of the game with the narrative, but I just have to leave it there. There's a ton to uncover with her, and she's a fantastic character. Next, moving on, my personal favorite in the game, that is Freya, and she's an anthropomorphic mouse-like character, but of course, like all these other characters, she is much more than that, and her role is that of tragedy and despair. Freya the Dragon Knight, or Dragoon, if you will, has imposed on her despair in a kind of universal way. The game keeps knocking her back over and over and over. She's resolved trying to protect the people that she loves. She's set back, knocked down. Basically, the universe is kicking her while she's down, and to push through it is remarkable to see. She's by far the most unluckiest character in the entire game, and she's just so awesome. And the portrayal of Dragoons in this game are fantastic. The fact that they're given dragon abilities, which are kind of like magical attacks, are great. I love them. I wish more Dragoons had that kind of ability. So moving on, next one is a little bit more interesting, and that is Eco or Aiko. I don't really know. I call her Eco. I may be completely wrong. And she's a small child with a horn on her head, and she's been imposed in a sort of exile, having to make friends with these creatures, these Moogles. And again, she must go and overcome something like all of our characters have, and she has to cope with this solitude and learn how to make the most of those who've befriended her and kept at her side. And really, that's all I can possibly say about Eco, because she joins the party fairly late in the game compared to the other series, where you get most of the party members fairly closely to the beginning of the game. You'll play about 14-15 hours maybe, and then you'll get Eco and this next character I'm about to talk about, who is Amaranth. Amaranth is one of the last main characters that join you, and Amaranth would be your resident kind of monk character, monk ninja, I guess. Though his appearance is more, let's say, like a fighter from Final Fantasy. He has this stark red crazy hair, which is cool. But Amaranth, I don't know, he always felt kind of unnecessary to me. I mean, you notice a theme here though with all of these characters. Most have to survive struggles in their life. He has a sort of moral hurdle to overcome, being arrogance. And I do like him as a character. It's just, he comes in really, really late. I mean, he's one of the last characters you get, and I just think that the game didn't really need him. But you know what? I'm not going to complain. The more the merrier, I guess. Except for this last one. Alright, so I try to make these a little bit more informational and not try and impose my views here, but this is one character that I have to talk about, and it's... oh, okay. So... the last character I'm going to talk about, who is an optional character, and that's Quina. I think it's optional for most of the game. I could be wrong. Every time I've played it, I've gotten her or him. And Quina is a thing that will join you. It's very ambiguous. They join you to go on a pilgrimage across the world to eat stuff. And Quina is basically put in the game for some much needed levity, I guess. And the thing that just really saddens me is that Quina is our blue mage of the game, and that's where I have issues with the character. So we don't have any kind of red mages or time mages or anything, but we do have a blue mage, or what should have been a blue mage. Quina is just, it's a missed opportunity, and that's what gets me so down about this character. Specifically, it would have been a fantastic chance to put a blue mage character in the game that's a true traditional, what we know as now traditionally blue mage character. I'm talking about blue robes, scimitar wielding, slightly Middle Eastern garb, able to learn unique abilities, maybe have a little bit of a Beastmaster control on characters. We've never gotten anything like that in a Final Fantasy, especially in a main single player Final Fantasy, and this would have been perfect. The characters, the setting, all of that just screams we need a blue mage, but we get Quina. And the blue mage that I talk about could have had levity as well. It could have been maybe even like a Radagast character from The Hobbit, you know, but we get Quina. And I don't know, I just don't like it. And I've posted online and I get completely just shat on because people like Quina, and that's fine. It's just, for me, my personal opinion, it's a very huge missed opportunity, and I would have loved to see a real blue mage character taking the place of this Quina character. You could have had Quina in the game as another NPC or a character that joins you, you know, throughout the game, but not as a main kind of character to focus around. I don't know. I guess the thing that really gets me sad is that this is one of the most perfect cast of characters except for that, and that just makes it hurt all the more. But anyway, just to finish up with our heroes now. While it's nothing new, we do get a lot of guest characters that are kind of secondary cast that you're going to spend quite a bit of time with. Some of these characters are really, really integral to the plot and relationships, and you would actually have expected them to join permanently, especially one character named Beatrix, and she really does feel like a main character. There are times whenever you battle with her and she has all these skills and stuff that you may have seen from previous older games. For instance, a lot of her skills come from Final Fantasy VII and Cloud's Limit Breaks, and from this, Beatrix can also heal. Beatrix is a paladin. She even has a face icon whenever you finish battles with her that will show up, as if she was supposed to be a main character, but was cut for whatever reason, maybe time constraints or something. Beatrix is probably one of the most awesome main characters that isn't a main character. Let's move on to the major villain of the game, and you don't meet him until a little bit later, in fact at the end of disc 1. So if you want to just completely skip this part of the video, please do so. There are some slight spoilers, but I don't think it's really that much of a spoiler. The person that I'm going to talk about is Kuja. Kuja's a character of many different layers. He has, like our main cast, a very kind of central aspect to him, a flaw that he would have needed to overcome. and that would be that he is a narcissistic character, what you may expect, any kind of villain to be. He willingly embraces all of it, all of that narcissism. He wants to be the most powerful. He wants all of this stuff for him. He's the most grandiose and pompous character for sure. And as much as I'd love to talk about his role more in the story, I can't, because he is just tied to all of these crazy plot twists and spoilers and everything. So Kuja, maybe not my favorite villain, but he's maybe top 5 for me. He's a competent villain to be sure, but overall there's been better out there and there's been much, much worse. And as far as the story goes in general, we're immediately introduced to the underlying framing of the story via a play-like structure. Specifically, the play is called I Want to Be Your Canary, and it's referenced many, many times throughout the entire game, and it certainly reinforces the themes of the story itself, at least in broad strokes. In Final Fantasy IX, you're going to see a continuation of summoning also growing much, much more important with regards to the story, and I'm talking just about like Final Fantasy IX as a single entry in the entire franchise of Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy VI kind of really started to harp on the summons, and I told you way back in that video that they would get more and more intense, and you can definitely see that come to light right now. So the setting and the world, like I said, are very much a return to traditional high fantasy based worlds, and here we have a bit of steampunk thrown in rather than really hard Magitech. When I think of Magitech, I think of Final Fantasy VI, maybe Final Fantasy XII, something like that. This is more of a steampunk kind of twist on that, even though it technically is still Magitech. It's also kind of weird that we start on this continent with a bunch of mist around. And the reason I say it's weird is because we actually started to see this mist miasma trend in video games at this particular time when it released. Things like Legend of Legaia had a big mist element, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles had a big mist element to it, and I'm sure a lot more. I just remember there being a lot of games with mist in them for whatever reason. But anyway, moving on, there are a lot of classic Final Fantasy twists here that you can expect. It's very dense in that regard. As the threat builds more and more, all of this other crazy stuff keeps happening. And as you get further and further into the game, you can get these character threads that kind of intertwine, and everyone has to overcome, at least in some way, everyone else's major setback. You get sorrow, you strive for this virtue, you have honor, you have loyalty, you have arrogance, you have all of these different personalities that each character symbolizes, but every character has to overcome in some way all of these traits, or aspire to get all of these traits. Many times we're going to see a character resolving an issue, or at least trying to, and it's only going to be paralleled much later in the game in a much, much larger and more intense way. It's quite genius how intricate the game weaves all of these stories and plot lines throughout. There are a few more details I'd like to acknowledge before I end this. First is something not actually about the game itself, but I can't not mention it, and it's about the strategy guide. I haven't really even talked much about strategy guides. It may seem weird that I'm bringing up this strategy guide stuff. I mean, why would I even do that? But this strategy guide was such a colossal failure on Square's part, and you might be wondering, what does that even have to do with anything? Well, if you'll remember, at the top of the video, I talked about this being developed alongside Final Fantasy X and 11. Well, Final Fantasy 11 is a huge reason for the failure of how this strategy guide was working. When Final Fantasy started to push towards the online territory with Final Fantasy 11, we saw the emergence of this Play Online program, which actually launched concurrently with Final Fantasy IX, and it was touted as this sort of revolutionary Final Fantasy application covering everything about the series. It was going to be everything that Final Fantasy was. So they were pushing this incredibly hard on the people, so much that Final Fantasy IX's guide was littered with all of these Play Online keywords. In fact, I have a hard copy right now that I'm looking at, and to call it a strategy guide would be disservice to that word. This book is completely anemic, providing bare minimum information, forcing you to go on this Play Online site to get the full experience of the book. I see what they were trying to do, but they shouldn't have done it. I mean, immediately after this, we went back and we got our regular strategy guides that we like. And in fact, I cannot understate how outraged fans were with this, and rightly so. It's a terribly large blunder as far as the Final Fantasy franchise is concerned. It's up there with like Spirits Within, and that may be just a weird, crazy thing, but a lot of people, including myself, bought, and honestly, even now, I still buy strategy guides, not to look at all the information or whatever, but just to read it and look at it in a casual sense. I like looking at maps, I like looking at all the art, and the fact that this book just completely skimped on most of that is just a terrible mistake, and not one that's ever happened again. In fact, I believe recently that they have released a proper Final Fantasy IX strategy guide in a PlayStation strategy guide collection collector's edition. Alright, so one last thing I want to get to, and this is in spoiler territory, but I'm not going to spoil it, overtly, but I do have to talk about it. Another issue with the game is the final boss, who I won't tell you what it is or anything, but fans were not happy in the slightest to see this, and if you do play this game, you may feel, I guess the best word would be confused, and if you are, that's okay. You and pretty much every single other person that's ever played this game and beaten it are confused about it. It should not restrict you from the enjoyment of the game, but I do want to warn you, don't judge this game solely on its final boss. It makes sense, but they could have done it so much better. Just please enjoy this incredibly fantastic journey through the history of Final Fantasy. And that's where I'll end it there. I'll wrap this video up. I want to say thank you all so much for watching. Final Fantasy IX, as I said, is one of my top 3 Final Fantasy games. It really was sort of a last hurrah with Final Fantasy. Some people do say that it even ended Final Fantasy there. Whatever your feelings are, as we slip into the PlayStation 2 era, games start changing quite radically for the Final Fantasy, especially from the proper Final Fantasy that we know. Each has their own opinion about this trend in the series, but regardless, whatever you think about the series from here on out, we still have this fantastic masterpiece of a game, no matter what the future holds for Final Fantasy. And if you enjoyed this, please share this around, maybe even drop a sub. Gotta get that self-promotion in there. But anyway, if you haven't, please definitely check out Final Fantasy IX on Steam or PS4. This is one of the best games to start with the franchise. It really gives you a sense of what Final Fantasy, at least classic Final Fantasy, is. It was truly one of the quintessential Final Fantasy games, and as we end this month of Valifor, we're gonna go dive straight into the month of Hades and the more spooky side of the series, I guess. Well, I don't really know if there's gonna be any spooky stuff, but we're in the month of Hades because it's October. But for now, let's just enjoy the intro to this fantastic installment of this series. Enjoy.